Looks like Jane Adler has a question. Can you unmute her so we can hear the, or do I do that?
I did it.
Okay.
Okay, there she is.
I clicked on the link to get on here because I could not find a Zoom number and password. So we got on that way, but I have a text from Linda Storfer asking for the password.
It's on the website. If she
I told her to click on the link and she would get it. On the website, there's all kinds of script writing that's very hard to read, and that.
No, you just click on it.
That's what I'm telling her, but I don't know. Is she coming on?
All you have to do is press the link.
That's
Put
what I
your finger on the
texted her.
The host is not allowing me to speak. That's you.
That's me. Oh, Sheila has a question, apparently. We haven't said a word. We got all these questions already. Wait.
Tell them I want to say something.
Are you on?
I'm trying to be on.
Well, then how could you
Do
talk?
you see me here?
No.
I don't have a microphone. Unmute. The host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves. So maybe she has to unmute me. Can you ask her to? She won't hear me.
Oh, there you are.
Can you ask her to unmute me?
Judy, can you hear me now? Alana, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you unmute Melinda for a
just a
second?
minute.
Just for a second. Still red.
There. Okay. Whoa. Let me go in the other room because this is too loud. Okay. The easiest way to get on, you don't even need a password. Just go to the email that was sent, the what's happening. There's a link. You hit the link and you automatically go on and just say join a meeting. Okay, you don't need a password. Okay, you can mute me.
Okay, I'm going to mute everyone except the rabbi.
That means I have to talk, huh?
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back just a little because look like you can't see the top of your head. Yeah, that's good.
All right, Judy. Don't hear Judy.
Well, she was muted.
Good evening, everybody.
Good.
Wow.
Okay.
Temple Beth Am's programming welcomes you all. First, a few technical comments.
31 people saying.
Please type any questions that you have for the rabbi that he will answer after his class. And you could do that anytime during his lecture or at the end, but only use the chat for that. Okay, so any questions will be through the chat. You have been muted. Please do not unmute yourself because we will mute you again. Background sounds are very difficult for the speaker. Also, if your name on your video box is different from your actual name, please click on the 3 dots at the top right of your video box. Then click rename for this session so we know who you are. And before Rabbi begins, I want to personally invite you all to this Sunday's performance by Hudson Sound of New York City. They are a young, up-and-coming group, and they're an a cappella group. And that will begin at 3:30 sharp, and it will be followed by Minyan. Join us for a much-needed service of healing on Wednesday, July 22nd at 7 p.m. with Mindy Islander. And Tisha B'Av services will take place on Wednesday, July 29th at 7:30 p.m. along with Temple Beth Torah, Shaharat Tzedek of Tamarack. Now on with the show. Did you know that Israel has the highest number of museums per capita in the world? Did you know that over 1,000 letters arrive in Jerusalem yearly addressed to God? And did you know that in 1952, Albert Einstein was asked to be president? He declined. And did you know that the glue on Israeli stamps is kosher? Well, these are fun and trivia facts. But now Rabbi gets to talk to us about really important information, the current politics in Israel. And with that, I turn our Zoom meeting over to the Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Did you know why Einstein turned down the offer?
Tell us.
It was only relative.
Okay.
It can't get worse from there, right? That's what I'm thinking. All right. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all. And we are recording this. Yes, I think we are.
Yes.
So those who you may know who can't make it tonight will have that opportunity. And here's the deal. We're talking about a subject that is, on one hand, pretty simple and straightforward. How you describe an electoral process, especially if you're a political science alumni, as I am, and so is Melinda, by the way. One of the things we discovered we have in common. But it's also at the same time incredibly complicated. The headlines make it look like every other, I was going to say day, but I'd say every other 10-minute period, there's a threat of a new election in Israel, and they've only had 3 in the last year. So it is, clearly it's a complicated process, and we'll try to uncomplicate it as much as possible. So in order to do that, let's go back in time to the beginning of the country and remind ourselves how the system of electoral process works in Israel. And of course, what that means in simple terms is how it's different from what we're used to here. We're used to a 2-party system, which means in order to win, you have to get 51% of the vote. That is the same universally any place there's an election. The difference is in America, you only have one other party to worry about, usually, whereas in Israel, there's approximately anywhere from 6 to a dozen in any given year, different political parties with different agendas and different constituencies, which make their numbers go up or down given on a particular year and what's going on at that time. So what I hope to do tonight is re-explain that system so we understand how and why it works the way it does, and go through a little bit of the history of elections as they've happened in the history of Israel since 1949, when they had the first actual election, and down to the recent situation affecting the current government of Israel. Along the way, we'll talk about some of the leading names in Israeli politics today, other than, of course, Netanyahu, who is still the current prime minister, and his name is probably the best known of all of them. But there are other names that are equally significant, and we'll try to explain who they are and what their background is, and what the chances are of them someday being prime minister. So let's start with the beginning. The Knesset, as you may know, has 120 seats in it. Just like the Congress of the American government has a set number of seats, one of the differences is that the American Congress is elected by geographical location. You elect a representative of the geographical location in which you live. Those districts are decided by Congress itself. And so everybody knows what territory within the United States your particular candidates are attempting to represent. That is not the case in Israel. You do not represent a specific geographical location. It doesn't matter what city or town or kibbutz you're from. You could have all 120 of them living in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. That's just the way the system works. The system also works by what's called proportionate voting. So that means the people who are voting do not vote for a specific candidate. You're not voting for the current prime minister, a previous prime minister, or who you hope will be the next prime minister. You vote for the particular political party that you feel akin to. And basically, if your political party manages to get every single vote cast in that election, then you would get all 120 seats in the Knesset to appoint. Part of the task of each political party before the election is to create a list of 120 individuals ranked in priority order and sequence, starting with number 1, going to 120. And that means that these are the 120 people in order that your party would designate as the next members of Knesset holding the 120 seats. Now, the likelihood of getting every single seat is practically nil. So if you got 50% of the electoral vote, your party did, that is, then you would be entitled to 1/2 of the seats, or 60, being 1/2 of 120. If you got 10% of the vote, you'd have 12 seats in the next Knesset. So your job as a political party is to rank the politicians that you want to be serving your party's interest in the Knesset. And the person that you designate as number 1 is, if it's the largest party, will be the prime minister. That's how that system works. So let's see. If you get 30% of the votes cast, you'd end up with 36 seats, which is right around the average number that the winning parties have tended to have. Now, what does that mean? If you only have 36 seats, then clearly you're pretty far away from the 61 you would need to control the Knesset. Because if you have 120 altogether, 50% plus 1 would mean 61 seats. To get 61 seats, you'd have to get 51% of the vote in that year's election. That's never happened. Not once has a party gotten that many votes in order to be the ruling party. So instead, you have to approach the smaller parties, the ones who end up with, based on their proportion, 15, 12, 10, 8, 5 seats, and getting them to agree to form a coalition with you. And that means you've got to make deals if you want to be the prime minister who's going to govern. You have to make deals with all these little parties. And that's why the minor, smaller parties have much more power than they might have in a strictly representative type of election. So all through the history of Israel, there have been a number of parties that are referred to as the religious parties. These are political institutions put together by members of the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox community. And you have 2 primary parties still in existence today. It's gone up and down, different numbers, different interests. But the 2 primary ones are called Shas, and the second one is called UTJ, which stands for United Torah Judaism. Shas represents the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox community, and UTJ represents the Ashkenazic ultra-Orthodox community. They often vote similarly to each other. They often have the same issues, same priorities, and their votes in any election year go somewhere between 6 up to maybe 12. So that gives you an idea of how small they are in proportion to the rest of the electoral community in Israel. But it also explains why they get certain privileges, because any party that wanted to form the coalition government needed these smaller parties to put them over the 51% of the total election. So that's why, in order to get into a coalition, you know they have certain demands. And among those demands are funding from the state, for ultra-Orthodox institutions. A synagogue. If you're an ultra-Orthodox synagogue in Israel and you want to build a shul, you don't have to have a building fund. Hard to imagine, isn't it? Wouldn't that be wonderful? You just go to the state gives you the check, you build your building, you hire your rabbi, and the salaries of the rabbis are paid for by the government. A lot of these things happen just naturally, and that's because every political party on the right or the left has needed and has used and has negotiated with and has gotten agreements from these religious parties to form that coalition. The religious parties, frankly speaking, don't really care who the governing body is as long as they keep promising to the things that they need, the funding, changing policies as far as conversion, the whole Western Wall situation, the section that was set up for non-Orthodox, that whole agreement is in jeopardy primarily because of the political power that these small religious parties tend to have. So they're small, but they're powerful because they're small and they're yet big enough to make a difference in forming a coalition government. So that gives you a ballpark idea of how the system works and why it may seem to be a little chaotic to us. It actually makes a lot of sense from their standpoint. Now, if you go back to the beginning, David Ben-Gurion, being the first prime minister, had to face the decision about to what extent do we allow the religious parties to have any say? Because David Ben-Gurion was clearly not a religious Jew, not in any sense of the word, but he pretty much felt after the Holocaust, what's the difference? Give these people a chance to do something, to have some control over their lives. The reality is that he believed, as many did at the time, they were wrong, but they believed at the time that orthodoxy is going to disappear. It can't keep up with the times. There's no way it's going to survive. So let's give them a couple of years of feeling that they have some say, they have some power, and before you know it, they'll disappear and we won't have to worry about it. That is, at least from what we know, part of his thinking back in the late 40s as the creation of the state was taking place. So that's more or less how that works. Now, in the history of Israel's elections, and you would think they're supposed to be 4 years, just like America's, there hasn't been a single election that lasted 4 years. Because another aspect to Israeli politics is that at any time, the Knesset can consider a motion of no confidence. And that means that you have enough members of Knesset, even from the parties that agreed to form a coalition with the current prime minister. Every now and then, something will come up that makes them angry enough to want to bring the government down. And if you get enough votes in the Knesset, the vote of no confidence succeeds, the government is finished, it's through. And you have no choice but to call a brand new election. And this has happened pretty much every 2-3 years. It's very rare that a government that got elected, formed a coalition, was able to last all 4 years and then go on to a re-election or something else. So in the history of Israel's elections since 1948 until relatively recently, let's say 5 to 10 years, the two main parties, almost always in opposition to each other, were called the Labor Party on the left and the Likud Party on the right, although they weren't always called that. The Labor Party back in the beginning was called Mapai, which is an abbreviation of 3 letters. And Likud back then in the original years was called Cherut. And the head of the Labor Party was always Ben-Gurion. The head of Cherut was Menachem Begin. And he was always in a relatively small percentage of the opposition back in those days. But that lasted for the first 20 or so years of Israel's existence and elections. Labor was considered, as I said, a little bit on the left, somewhere between center left, and the Cherut or Likud was considered center right. Now, the question, of course, is, what does it mean to be right-wing or left-wing in the vantage point of Israeli politics? There are really two primary, I guess you'd call them issues, that divide the political leadership of the country. One would be economic policies, which, by the way, is the same case that we're used to here in America. Excuse me. And the second would be, in the easiest way to refer to it is peace policies, whatever that means at a given set of years or a given decade. So among the more well-known terms that deal with the peace process, one is called Land for Peace. This goes back to 1967, 20 years into Israel's existence, when the Six-Day War brought to Israel 3 times the size of the territory it had between 48 and 67. Now they had all this territory that they managed to win in the context of the Six-Day War of 1967. The question was always, what do you do with it? Well, most books from that time make it clear that most Israeli politicians never expected to hold on to that land. It was never a strategy of the military leaders to advance the borders to include those territories. They were never happy with the borders they had, but they weren't going to go to war in an attempt to expand those territories. So since they now have all that land, the division within the Israeli political world was, do we use this land and trade it back to various Arab countries for the purpose of and for the goal of creating peace with the Arab neighbors? And obviously there were some more willing and some less willing, and that's became part of the right-wing, left-wing divide. The right wing pretty much feeling more than the left wing that this land is crucial for our self-defense and we should never give it back. But then again, you had those on the right wing who said, well, we could give it back under the following circumstance, but not this one, not that. And so that's why you had a lot of differences even within the right wing and left wing. And that's why you've got multiple parties, some of which it may be hard for us to understand why they got started, what the difference is, and what you need them for. But let's just review on the labor side of Israel's history. You have names that may be familiar to you, Ben-Gurion, of course, but also names like Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister during the Six-Day War, Golda Meir, who was the prime minister during the Yom Kippur War. Who else do we got? Yitzhak Rabin, of course, the only prime minister so far to have been assassinated. God willing, he'll be the only one. Ehud Barak, another general who became prime minister, and of course, Shimon Peres. Those were among the leading leaders of the labor side of Israeli politics. On the right-wing side, you have, of course, Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon, Yitzhak Shamir, and of course, Benjamin Netanyahu. So that's more or less a history of the electoral process. Now, having said that right-wing, left-wing often divides itself by the ideological leaning towards peace or perhaps more pushing for war, the assumption is always that the right wing was more hawkish and the Labor Party, the left wing, was always more dovish. And of course, when you say that, it sounds so simple and it seems to make sense, but the truth is it's very much more complicated than that, in the same way that in American history, one of the biggest shocks of all, an earthquake in American politics, was when Nixon, of all presidents, made peace with China, went to China, had relations with China, created a recognition with China. Nobody ever expected that from Nixon. And in the same way, the major earthquakes of politics that have happened in Israel's history happened with leaders that one never would have expected it to happen. So, for example, it was Menachem Begin, the hawkiest of the hawks. And no, I don't think there's a word called hawkiest, but what the heck. So he, of all people, was willing to make peace with Anwar Sadat of Egypt and traded land for peace. Gave back the entire Sinai Desert, which had newly discovered oil refineries that weren't there in the time before Israel captured it in the Six-Day War. They found it between 67 and 77 and could have made them energy independent, but they were willing to give that back. They left the Suez Canal, they left the border, and went back to the original armistice of 48. So nobody expected that from Menachem Begin, but yet it happened. Then, of course, you have Ariel Sharon unilaterally withdrawing from the Gaza Strip. Now, he did it because of logistics, because of practicalities. It wasn't an ideological thing. To the contrary, he was one of the preachers of the message, not 1 inch goes back to the Arabs. And yet he also understood that for Israel to forever, in all of eternity, hold on to the Gaza Strip, which has close to 2 million impoverished, hopeless, terrible conditions, population there, plus there are people who clearly are angry and for Bissiner, and they have lots of weapons from Iran and other places. It's not a safe place for us to remain. And so there were something like 30,000 Jews living in Gaza at the time. Beautiful villages, kibbutzim, greenhouses. They brought the land to life. But Sharon said, for the betterment of Israel, not for religious purposes, not for political purposes, just because it's better for us to get the heck out of there, he pushed for that disengagement and that withdrawal. It was very popular for some, very unpopular for others. The irony from an electoral standpoint is that withdrawing and giving up land for peace is a left-wing agenda item. And yet here was one of the most right-wing prime ministers adopting that position. It made for an interesting electoral response to those policies. Another shockwave was when Yitzhak Rabin, who, although he was a middle to left, he's part of that Labor Party culture and world, yet he was also a major character in the development of the armed forces of Israel. He was a major character in the War of Independence, great heroic deeds on a military basis that he performed and led. He became the chief of staff during the Six-Day War and Yom Kippur War. He was the general's general. And so from a military standpoint, again, you expect a military specialist to really be harsh on your Arab neighbors and do whatever you can to put them down and put Israel up. And yet the policy that had stuck through Labor and Likud over and over again was, we will never negotiate with Yasser Arafat and the PLO because they are terrorists. Never, 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 until Rabin said, well, maybe. And that opened up a whole new door to negotiations, sitting at the table, which unfortunately didn't yield the results we wanted, but at least it started the process and opened it up. And that door is still open to this day, although it doesn't look like any results come from it. Apparently, Mahmoud Abbas was quoted as saying just yesterday that he's still willing to sit down at the table with Israel. So we'll see where that goes, but he never would have said that had it not been for Rabin opening the door to the possibility of Israelis and Palestinians meeting at a table. So those were at least three. Begin with Egypt, Sharon with Gaza, and Rabin with Arafat and the PLO. Three major surprises that you would never have expected to happen based on their political background and ideology. Now, when you want to also figure out the differences between right and left in Israel, there's a brilliant statement that was made by Shimon Peres, in which he was attempting to clarify the distinction between right and left. And he put it in one sentence, as which was brilliant. What he said was, the right believes that peace will come from security, and the left believes that security will come from peace. So that's kind of a politician's way of clarifying a very complicated set of beliefs and ideas. Let's take a look now at the history of some of Israel's elections so that we can understand the political process, the structure, and then we'll close out by talking about the current situation. So going back to David Ben-Gurion, the very first prime minister, let's remember that there's certain stereotypes, just like there are stereotypes of George Washington. And for those of you who had the privilege of watching Hamilton this past week, you know that it's a beautiful, wonderful musical, and it puts certain realities in a different perspective than most of us ever thought of, just because of the brilliance of the compositions. But when we think about George Washington, we think of a man who was not only a great leader and not only the father of his country, but we think of him, probably erroneously, as perfect, as so totally enamored of the populace of the country. We just assumed that every single American loved this man to death and couldn't believe that there could ever be a better president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then, you know, you open up a couple of books and you read about the reality and you find out that not everybody loved Washington. He had opposition before, during, and after he was president. And so the same is true with David Ben-Gurion. There are most people who believe that he was the only obvious choice to be the first prime minister because before the birth of Israel, he was sort of acting as if he were the prime minister because of the position he had with the Jewish Agency and because of his role in pre-state Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But it turns out that if you go back and check the records of that very first election, and remember, the country is primarily left and right and middle, and left means Labor Party and right means Cherut or Likud Party. And so when we go back to that first election, we find out that he had 46 seats out of the 120 were entitled to his party based on the election that year. 46 means that more than half of the population of the country preferred a different party altogether than the party of Ben-Gurion, which means they preferred a different candidate than Ben-Gurion to be the prime minister. Now, that's mind-boggling. That's shocking. To think of the father of Israel as a country only had 46 seats, meaning his party had less than 50% of the votes. The opposition, Cherut, that year only had 14. So it shows they were also not popular. Obviously, there were more parties between these two and around these two that added up to the different numbers to get you up to 120. But it shows that Ben-Gurion wasn't as universally popular as he's sometimes made out to be, and he had a hard time of it. He resigned once or twice, and somebody else came in, and then he came back and got reelected. It was a complicated history. Any biography of Ben-Gurion is worth your reading. You will probably be surprised. Let's move on to the 60s, and we'll talk about Levi Eshkol. Levi Eshkol was a fascinating individual. Never was thought of as a person with a great deal of charisma. Pretty quiet, pretty shy, pretty reserved. He got elected in 1963, which means you're getting close to the Six-Day War. That was 67. but you're not there yet. And you're, of course, not thinking of a full-scale war yet. You're still hoping that you're going to create peace with your neighbors. And that's, what goes on. How did Eshkol got elected? Because that's when Ben-Gurion finally quit, resigned, said, I'm done. I don't want this politics anymore. I want to go to the Negev. I want to establish my home on the kibbutz there called Sde Boker. It's still there to this day. If you visit Sde Boker, you can visit the actual home that he lived in. It has been kept and preserved exactly as it was on the day he died. And it's an amazing thing to see how simple the prime minister of this country, how simple an existence he lived. And you can see his desk, what book he was reading, because the book is still open to the page he was on. It's really an exciting experience to have. Anyway, so Eshkol got elected in the first election after Ben-Gurion was out. And then just before the Six-Day War, which was 66, so 66 minus 63 is 3 years. He didn't make it 4 years. There was a vote of no confidence. He did get reelected, Levi Eshkol did. But by 66, now you're close to the Six-Day War. The threats of that war were becoming more and more intense. People were afraid. They were afraid to rock the boat. And therefore, they didn't want to make a change. And so Eshkol got elected by a pretty large, substantial coalition. Now, his coalition had 77 seats to 43 on the other side. Now, that doesn't mean there were 77 seats in his party, but 77 altogether with the smaller parties that he got to agree to join with him. Golda Meir comes next. Now, Golda Meir is another name that we think of as super duper powerful, super duper woman, very popular, we assume. And then you read biographies of her and you find out she never wanted to be prime minister. She resented the whole pressure that was put on her. They told her, you have no choice. You're the only one. You have to. And she really suffered miserably. And then came the Yom Kippur War, and she felt personally responsible. And she kept saying, I should never have been in this position, filled with guilt and shame, and so resigned shortly after the Yom Kippur War, which almost was a total defeat for Israel. And we all know what would have happened then. We wouldn't be discussing this subject. Anyway, so that was a rough period in the 60s. Menachem Begin, the first right-wing government, he's elected in 1977, shortly after Golda Meir. Now, his coalition was 61. So you can see how close he was to the bare minimum to form a government. He got 61 seats in the Knesset to form a coalition with him, and that worked pretty well for a while. He got turned off to political leadership, not after the Yom Kippur War, but after the war in Lebanon, which went on way longer than anyone expected. Many, many tragic losses, both on our side and on the Lebanese side. And again, he felt torn by the amount of death that happened as a result of that war, and he went off into retirement as a result of that. Then we come to Yitzhak Rabin. He got elected in 92, served for 3 years. His coalition, when he first got elected, because there was a period that he was in between, and then he got reelected later on. Anyway, his first election had 62 seats. Again, you can see how close the politics is. And what this means, and this is the key for us to remember, and the main point of tonight, if every election is like 60, 61, 62, 63, you realize how close it is. And the difference between the 63 on the winning side and the 57, let's say, on the losing side, is the difference between right wing and left wing. And if you realize how close the elections always seem to be, then you realize how divided the country is, how divided the population that does the electing, how they are pro this, anti that, and it's almost 50-50. It's very hard to lead a country like that because everyone has a strong opinion, and because the issues of peace and land and a two-state solution and a one-state solution and where's the state, how many states, where's the state, who are we talking to? All these conversations for the average Jew is a life and death discussion. And that's why it's as complicated, and that's why the population is split right down the middle. Ariel Sharon got elected in 2001 and again in 2003. So his first term only lasted 2 years. And in his election, he had 66 seats, a little bit more, because at that time, that was after the Intifada, if you recall, a lot of terrorism against Israel. So there was a desire to have somebody they perceived of as tough and strong who was going to end it all, end the violence, that is. And that's why he got a few more seats. But it's still not overwhelming. 66 out of 120 is not an overwhelming majority. And going back to what we said at the beginning, you could get elected. You could have your majority. You could have your 60 plus seats in the Knesset. But if the religious party is 8 or 6 or 10 of those seats, and you do something or consider something to reach out to the Jews outside of Israel, a lot of prime ministers have gotten involved in some of those issues, such as the whole Western Wall compromise, to have a site reserved for non-Orthodox Jews, for conservative and reform. And then when that happens, the religious party, they arch their back and they start causing political trouble and they start threatening to bring the government down, even though on every other issue, you're kind of in agreement. And so that's part of the history of Israel's political world as well. I'm going to end by talking about our good friend, Bibi Netanyahu. What an interesting career. Fascinating. And we saw this past year alone that how difficult and complicated Israeli politics are, because they had to go through not one, but 3 separate elections, not one of which really brought a definitive result. But let's see if we can put this into some kind of perspective. 2015 to 2019 is his first term. And he made it through. He got through the 4 years. Now, that government, the one that ended in 2019, had 67 seats in its coalition. Okay, but it fell because some of the people that made up the coalition decided they didn't like some of the things he was agreeing to do. And let's also remember that with Netanyahu, who clearly has a very special kinship for and relationship with President Trump, they seem to see eye to eye on a number of issues. You can't find too many American presidents who have been so outspoken in public about allowing Israel to pretty much do what it wants. And that makes a difference to a prime minister. But regardless of any of the differences or the attempt to keep it bipartisan, one of the great purposes of AIPAC is to constantly remind us, doesn't matter what party the current president or senators or congressmen are, we have to attempt to keep it, the support for Israel bipartisan, because there's always going to be another election, and everything that you are familiar with today could change dramatically on a pinhead tomorrow, if tomorrow is election day. So we have to maintain good relations with both Democrats and Republicans. It makes sense, perfectly logical. But that election, this was the last full election that worked. A government came from it, was 67 seats in his Knesset. Now, who made up the government then? His party, Likud, had 30. So 30 out of 67. That's a tiny percent when you think about it. And yet, he was the one who got to lead the government. The next in line was the Labor Party. And that was led by a gentleman named Yitzhak Herzog, whose father had previously been president of Israel, and whose grandfather had been chief rabbi in Ireland. That's where the family's roots are. So it's a very interesting family. He's considered liberal to the left. His party brought in 24 seats. So Likud and Labor, just the two of them with 30 to 24, that's a pretty close election. Again, almost even. Then you have the joint list. That's a general term we use for the 4 different Arab political parties. How many people do you know have no idea that Arabs have political parties that represent them in the government of Israel? Together, they represented 13 different seats. It's 4 different parties. They differ within themselves between right wing, left wing, how much relationship with Jews, how much not, et cetera, et cetera. So the 4 Arab parties add up to 13 seats. That was a lot. Then there's Yesh Atid, which means there is a future. They had 11 seats. They are led by an interesting gentleman named Yair Lapid. Very dapper, very handsome, very forward-thinking, highly educated. He was a leading journalist before he got into politics about 10 years ago. And when he entered politics, he was the breath of fresh air that everybody was looking forward to, that he would lead the country into the future. He'd be culturally aware of what it means to be a Jew without being religious himself, but he would also be part of the culture of the Jews and the culture of Israel, and he would preserve, he could be a good balance between right wing and left wing. At least that's what people thought. They ended up with 11 seats in what I believe that was his first campaign. Then there's another party with another gentleman who is known internally in Israeli politics, but not known outside of Israel. The party is called Kulanu, which means all of us together. They got 10 seats, and they're led by a very interesting gentleman named Moshe Kachlon, who is basically an economist. And so he's been like the minister of what's it called in Israel? Of finance, the finance minister. Also considered modern with it, very intelligent, and with a potential for future. Then there's a party called the Jewish Home. It's called that in English. And that is was led by a gentleman named Naftali Bennett. Now, he is pretty much as right-wing as Netanyahu. They're on a par in terms of their political conservatism, but one of the differences is Bennett wears a kippah, Netanyahu doesn't. So that makes Bennett more in flux and in tune with the more religious, but not the ultra-religious. He's more of a modern Orthodox Jew, and that makes, of course, a difference too. He was the spokesman for pushing the right wing, led by Likud, but pushing them a little bit more to the right as much as possible. In the middle of the war against Gaza, some years back, 2012-13, Netanyahu was trying his hardest with President Obama constantly pushing for ceasefires, and Netanyahu said, well, okay, we'll try it. And Bennett was pushing him to go further, go deeper, destroy Hamas. So that was one of the issues there. So you're talking about right-wing heavy, and right-wing light, I guess you would say. So that's Naftali Bennett, and the Jewish Home Party ended up with 8 votes. Then you have the Shas Party. They had 7 votes. Again, that's the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic group. They're led by a man named Aryeh Deri. Aryeh Deri is obviously an Orthodox Jew, ultra-Orthodox, but involved heavily in politics, which is unusual for ultra-Orthodox. But he also served a prison sentence for, I forget what it was for, but what? Tax evasion. There you go, tax evasion. That's always a good one. And he served a couple of years, and then he went back into government. So it's amazing. He was able to do that. Then there's UTJ, like I said before, was the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazic political party. They're led by a man named Yaakov Litzman, who was, up until the latest election, he was the health minister. Now, picture a guy with a long gray beard, the black coat, the black hat, the payas, the whole works. How much health science has this guy learned in his lifetime? It's kind of interesting. But because of political realities, he got appointed to be part of the coalition, and his reward was to become named Minister of Health. Anyway, there's one last party to think of, and that's called Yisrael Beiteinu, which means Israel is our home. They ended up in 2015 with 6 seats. They are led by a gentleman named Avigdor Lieberman, who was a Russian Jew, not Russian Jew like Ben-Gurion Russian, meaning born in 100 years ago, but Russian Jew in the Sharansky type of Russian Jew. In other words, the living among and within that period of closed immigration, where the Jews were radicalized because of their treatment, and then the doors opened, and 1 million plus of Jews from the former Soviet Union came to Israel to live. I mean, at the time they came, the total population was 5 million. That means it was 20% of the whole population were recent immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Lieberman was one of that crowd, and became a leader of the Russian citizens in Israel, pledged to keep them together with their own self-interest as an ethnic and cultural group. So that's the list. At least that's what it was back in 2015. Okay? Now, then comes the 3 elections that happened in rapid succession, a few months apart from each other. First one was in April of 2019. Likud, the party of Netanyahu, went from 30 seats to 35. But what was new was a brand new political party called Blue and White, the colors of Israel, led by a gentleman named Benny Gantz, who was a highly respected general in the Israeli armed forces. He had been the chief of staff in the previous government under Netanyahu, but they had a falling apart, and so Gantz decided to oppose Netanyahu. Likud party got 35 seats in the Knesset, Blue and White, 35 seats in the Knesset. So the way the system works, I had mentioned this before, is when the election is over, it's up to the president, who really has very few official roles. It's mostly ceremonial and an honorific kind of position, but it's up to the president, here's one of his very important jobs, to decide from all the people who got elected, all the parties who got elected, and the numbers that they received, who among the candidates seems the most likely to succeed in forming a coalition that would reach the number 61. And when the Likud and Black and White were tied at 35 seats each, that was an impossible decision. All the other parties, Shas, UTJ, the Arab parts, the Labor Party went down tremendously. So Blue and White gained on the backs of Labor. All the other parties were pretty small, but enough to add up if you put them all together. So that was the first election. It was too close to call. The president couldn't even get one of them to even try to form a government. The next election was about 6 months later in September. Now Black and White had 33, Likud had 32, which means Gantz did a little bit better than Netanyahu, but that meant the president said, all right, you got a shot at forming a government, but every time he tried negotiating with the smaller ones, he just couldn't get the job done, couldn't get enough of the smaller ones to agree. And by the way, another thing is that even if a small party, let's say has 9 or 10 seats, that doesn't mean all 10 of them have to vote the way the party votes. There are certain votes in the Knesset that each individual can vote his own way, and that's why you could be a majority today, and tomorrow it doesn't help. So that election ended with another freeze, another couldn't decide, and so they had to call a third election. That took place in March, April of 2020. In that election, Likud ended up with 36, but Blue and White ended up with 33. Labor was down to 7, just to give you an idea of how far they came. So Netanyahu was given the right to try, and his coalition didn't yet succeed. But what did happen is, of all the people who were elected to the Knesset, there was something that never happened before. Because it was the third attempt to create a coalition. And they were worried, my God, what if this happens again? We're already the laughing stock of the world, especially the democratic world. So what are we going to do? So the Knesset did something never done before. They wrote a letter to the president of the country, and all of them signed the letter, all 120 of them. And in this letter, they said, by a vote of 73 to 46, we, the members of the Knesset, are in favor of a government being formed by Benjamin Netanyahu. So that's what motivated the president to say, okay, give him another shot. And this coalition ended up being 61 to 58, which means the letter that said there were 73 in favor of Netanyahu still weren't. That means there were numbers still not willing to be a government with him, because there are people who think that he's under indictment, that he might not survive his term. So why should we reward him? You have that. You have the whole Iran situation, which is still a major concern, and things are clearly happening every day over there. You have Syria, where there's action, and you still have the Palestinians waiting for somebody to magically make them appear at a conference table. There's so much going on, but right now he is still in control. Now, can that change on a dime? Absolutely. The government can be brought down again, because if they only have 61 seats, they're awfully close to the limit that you're allowed. So that's my 2 cents. Let's see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Rabbi. And there are some questions.
Okay.
The first question, thank you, Maxine, is what percent of the population votes?
It's a very large percent. It's usually in the 70s, 70-ish percent, compared to America, which is like in the 30s usually, I think.
Okay, is there a limit to the number of parties you can have?
Well, yes and no. In order to be accepted as a political party, it takes more than just announcing, here we are. You have to have a policy statement, you have to have a list of authentic, legitimate candidates, and you have to enter an election and draw a certain percentage of the votes of that election. If you don't, if you get less votes than you had the year before, not less than the year before, if you have less than that number, and I don't remember what the number is, you're disqualified from running again. You can't just keep running and get 0.1% of the vote. I think it's 2%, I think is the 2 or 3%. And because there are so many small parties, there's often an attempt to say we ought to raise the minimum number. That will lower the number of political parties and make it easier, but that never seems to win when it comes up for an actual vote. But in order to be a political party, you have to win a certain number of votes in an election. That entitles you to run again the next year. And then you're officially a party, and that's it.
Okay. The next question is from Ira Morris. Can you speak about the annexation dispute?
Sure. Here's the deal. The West Bank, the area known as the West Bank, and what we call it is framed by politics. Because to call it the West Bank means it's the West Bank of what? Well, it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. So that ties it to Jordan. Other people call it occupied territories. Well, we didn't occupy it. We happened to be attacked in a war, and we disappointed our opponents by not losing. And that ended up, in terms of a result, as having all this territory. It's clear that the government at the time, that was the Levi Eshkol government, and those with him, after the 6-Day War, felt that that territory will have to negotiate. At some point, somebody will sit down with us at a peace table, because it hadn't happened up until then, and we'll sit and negotiate. They're going to say they want the whole West Bank back. We're going to say we want to keep the whole West Bank. And we'll end up talking, we'll negotiate, we'll compromise, and eventually we'll make an agreement. You'll get this, we'll get that, and everybody will go home, we'll shake hands, and we'll have peace. That's what they thought in the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War. Once Rabin came to power and negotiated with the PLO, and then came the Oslo agreements and a whole series of negotiations, heavy, intense stuff, one of the outcomes of that was that the West Bank was carved into 3 sections, which are affectionately known as A, B, and C. Very clever. And one of them was meant to be a string of Jewish populated territory. Another was meant to be mainly Palestinian territory. And they would be given the right, the authority, the legality to operate, to control, and to govern that part of the West Bank, including their own police, their own schools, their own civic institutions. And that was an agreed upon thing. And the third section was going to kind of be left empty. Nobody would really have residential buildings there. And at some point, we'd figure out what to do with it. So the land was divided between that which was mostly Jewish occupied, mostly Palestine occupied, mostly empty. So the annexation comes because there have been so many attempts to negotiate from which the Palestinians have walked away. And so there are some in Israel who say, if you force an agreement on the Palestinians, we'll never have peace with them. The only possible way to have peace is to negotiate legitimately and compromise. And we're both going to have to compromise. That was the assumption. But at some point, when you try and try and try and feel that there's no one on the other side really, really willing to not only sit down at a table to negotiate, but to carry it through to its conclusion, then why are we bothering? And how many times do we have to beg them to meet us at a table, all parts of the world, even here? What are we knocking ourselves out for? Let's just declare enough is enough. You wanted it, you could have had it. All you had to do was sit down and negotiate in sincerity. And we would have probably given back more than they expected. So that's more or less what's happened. And then you get a guy like Trump and a guy like Netanyahu that love to appear to the world as not playing games, and let's call a spade and let's be serious. And it's just a weird coincidence in American and Israeli history that those are the two leaders of America and Israel at this moment, when the American president, for the first time I can remember, and this isn't pro or con, this is a factual statement, first time that I can remember that a president of America has been so forthcoming in enabling an Israeli government to pretty much do what it wants. And so you have to assume that Netanyahu is anxious to get it done before the next American election in case it causes a change. And therefore, the next president may not be as forthcoming on those issues and may, in fact, apply a whole lot of pressure to withdraw. So Netanyahu is probably thinking that the sooner we can declare this land ours, it's harder to make us withdraw once we're already there. So that's probably the thinking of Netanyahu at this moment. And as long as he has support for now, he's probably going to continue. Nevertheless, there is an awful lot of pressure from the rest of the world, and the potential for violence breaking out after annexation takes place is pretty serious, and I'm sure that's weighing on Netanyahu's mind as well, and that's why there's some hesitation. Even though they declared it was going to take place last week, I think his opponents have probably gotten enough people in between them to kind of convey the seriousness of this decision. they're probably arguing, what's the rush? You know, let's wait a little bit longer. We waited this long. So those are the kinds of issues that are involved in the background of the annexation.
Thank you, Rabbi. From Jane Adler, what was the deal with Bibi serving and then Benny Gantz taking over?
So once before in Israel's history, the election was very, very divided and intense, and it was the right-wing, left-wing divide again. That was, who was that? That was Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Shamir, I believe. What happened was, because they couldn't agree, and neither one could get a coalition of 61, they both agreed to form what was called a rotation. And the rotation meant that each of the two candidates for prime minister, even though they're from opposite parties, agreed that they would take a 2-year term and then hand it over to the other. And no one at the time, because no one ever heard of such a thing, no one at the time thought it would actually happen. They were convinced that the guy who had the first 2 years would hold on to it and not let go, but he did. The government changed. It was smooth. It went fine. So apparently that was weighing on Netanyahu and Gantz's mind. It's clear that one could say, since it was mainly Gantz who was initiating the idea of a shared leadership, that he is the ultimate statesman who was willing to compromise his own political stature and right to be prime minister, or so some thought. And yet there were others who believe he gave in to Netanyahu. It shows that he's weak, he's not resolute, so how can we trust him in a time of crisis? So the very act that for some was considered an incredible statesman-like move ended up, for others, reflecting the opposite. But that's the agreement that they've made. And it's signed, it's sealed, it's delivered. We'll have to see, because we still don't know if the indictments against Netanyahu will lead to a sentencing. We don't know if he may have to be removed from office. It's a lot of unknowns. That's part of what makes politics in Israel so interesting.
Thank you. And the last question, in Israel, is there an equivalent body to the U.S. cabinet?
Yes, yes. They're called ministers instead of secretaries. One of the controversies over the last election is that part of the outgrowth of the attempt to enlarge the coalition and make it work, usually what makes a coalition is that all the different ministries or secretary positions, like Secretary of State, there's called the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So those positions are considered, as part of the political bargaining. So you kind of commit to the leadership of your opposing party that you want to turn into a coalition partner. You commit to them that you can have this ministry position, you can have that minister position. This one, no, this one I have to give to so-and-so. So there's a lot of bargaining that goes on, but all the ministers jointly are called the cabinet, just like here. They also have an inner cabinet called the security cabinet. That's made up of people who are specialists in security, intelligence, and military issues when there's a specific topic that has to be discussed and kept, A, secret, and B, limited to people who are truly experts and not political appointees. So you do have a cabinet, yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, everyone, for your cooperation. I'm going to attempt to unmute you if you would like to speak. So
the recording in.
How do I do that? Okay. Can you unmute